Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today is the second installment in my four-part series about how to structure and execute a client project as a freelance illustrator. The first topic we're tackling is the elements that go into a contract and a proposal, and those are timelines, usage scenarios, usage terms, and pricing. And in our last video, the first installment, we covered how to build a timeline. So how to figure out how long a project is going to take you, what phases you need to include, all of that. If you haven't watched that yet, I suggest either watching it first or adding it to your watch later. I guess you don't really have to do them in order, but it would definitely be helpful to see if you're wanting to get a sense for how to build a timeline into your project. So today we're going to talk about those other two elements, the usage scenarios and pricing. So how to think about and the types of ways that a client will potentially use your work, and then how to figure out pricing and what you should charge for it. So before we dive into the nitty-gritty, I want to say really quick that if you're doing a private commission, so like if you're creating work that is for somebody to hang on their wall in their home or office and they're not using it for any other purpose, pricing is fairly straightforward, and it's based basically on your time and the complexity of the piece, the size of the piece, cost of materials, all of that. So that's really not what we're going to talk about when we talk about pricing today. Today's conversation about pricing is going to be mainly geared towards commercial illustration. So that is illustration that is used, illustration that is on anything that is sold or that is used to sell things. So could be illustration on packaging, on clothing, in magazines, in comics, I don't know, in all sorts of different scenarios. Basically anything that's not somebody buying it to hang on their wall. And pricing in that scenario is highly dependent on how the illustration is used. So that's why the first thing that we talk about today, and why we're talking about these two things together, is usage terms and how those affect the pricing for a project. So for commercial illustration, determining the correct usage and pricing that appropriately is absolutely critical. So a few questions that you could ask to help determine the usage of the project would be: how will the client use the work? Where will the client use the work? How long will the client use the work for? Is this a custom illustration, so something you're creating from scratch for this client, or is it a reuse of an existing illustration? What industry is the client in? How big is the client? Does the client need any special circumstances like regional or national or worldwide exclusivity or perpetual use, so the ability to use it forever in lots of different circumstances, etc. Start by asking yourself those not yourself, start by asking the client those kinds of questions. And you may want to phrase it differently if you're, if you get a project inquiry. I don't suggest just like replying with these questions, but a good general starting point would be, how do you plan to use the illustration? And then the client will come back and say, oh yeah, I want to use it on, I don't know, I want to use it on, what is a good example? I just keep thinking of examples that are in my industry, but I guess we'll just go with those. So the client could come back and say, I want to use it on jam jars. And okay, so that's a starting point. It's packaging illustration, but there are still things that could influence the usage, and that would be, how big is the client? And that's a tricky thing to answer. So, if you get an inquiry from someone like Smuckers, or I don't know, like what's a big jam company? It's the only one I can think of. But if you get an inquiry from a company, from a jam company that you have seen in the grocery store, that you see in just like a regular grocery store, then that is probably a fairly good sized company. Not necessarily in all grocery stores, because there could be some artisanal products, but yeah, so if you recognize the brand, it's probably a pretty big company. If it's a brand you have never heard of before, you could ask, all right, where will this be sold? So, maybe they are only in a certain region of the US, like maybe they're only in California and the West Coast, or they're only in my area, they're only in New England, or might be even smaller than that. It could be just like a mom and pop establishment that's selling their jam at farmers markets. So you have like from the one extreme to jam that's being sold worldwide to the other extreme of jam that's being sold like out of someone's tent at a farmer's market, basically. So those two situations would require different pricing. So that's why it's so important to determine the usage. So some clients, especially more established clients, may already have that information in mind. They already may know what types of uses they need and what terms they need. Some small clients know that as well, although in my experience, I will say that small clients tend to ask for more rights than they actually need. So for example, that mom and pop selling jam at farmers markets, they don't need worldwide exclusivity because they're just selling it at a farmers market in the surrounding area to where their farm is or whatever. So you could potentially reuse that illustration for other purposes or relicense it to somebody in another region. And in addition, if they're wanting the really big national or international exclusivity, that's going to cost more. So a way that you can keep the prices more approachable for small clients is to limit the license initially. And when I do that, I always allow, I'll leave in a caveat in the contract that basically they'll get, if I'm approached by another company that wants to license it, I will first contact them to see if they want to buy out additional rights. So they might be able to start with just a very limited little license so that it doesn't cost them too much to get going. And then if they say they want to take their jam from farmers markets to maybe selling it at some regional Whole Foods, then that would require a bigger license. But basically, you can do it in steps. So yeah, and I know I say this all the time, but I will say it again. The Graphic Artists Guild Handbook for Pricing and Ethical Guidelines is so helpful here. The 15th edition just came out. Have it right here. I think overall, I probably am going to do a whole video on how it compares to the 14th edition, but from my first flip through, it doesn't seem like that much has changed. So if you have the 14th edition, that's already a good starting point. But if you don't have either of them, it's I think it's $26 on Amazon. It's the best $30 I've ever spent, I think. I know that's quite a statement, but it has been such a help to me in just feeling confident in knowing what industry standards are for uses. So it's part of what has helped me feel confident. A situation that happened last year, I was doing some illustration for a magazine and they wanted a total buyout, which has never happened to me with any other magazine. And according to the gag handbook, that's not typical at all either. And it's not like they were wanting to pay anymore. They were still paying actually a little bit lower than the average rate for spots, but they were expecting a full buyout. So having that confidence to know, okay, this is what's standard in the industry, that enabled me to say, oh, no, I'm only going to do it for these terms, which were the more standard terms for editorial illustration. So I will probably be referencing this again, but such a helpful resource. Highly recommend it. Say if you do end up in a situation where a client reaches out to you and says, I'm in this field, I want to use the illustration for this purpose. You can look it up in the handbook and you'll immediately get a sense of what is typical for the usage terms for that client. And then you can look again to figure out what's typical pricing or what's the price range. So that's a nice segue into the pricing element of our conversation. So pricing in commercial illustration factors in a number of different elements. So of course, like any work, you're going to be considering the complexity, the size, the time required, those typical things that you would, those typical points that you would use to price an illustration, even if you were doing it for a private commission. But then in addition to considering those things, you're also going to weigh very heavily the usage that the client needs, how the illustration will be used. And that is a big part of how it is priced. So a couple of examples of some different end uses and their corresponding pricing would be an average, so a mid-size, average level of detail, which even those things are so variable, so take this all with a grain of salt, but mid-size, average level of detail, spot illustration that's going to be used in a mid-size magazine, that will be potentially around $300. Now you could have that exact same illustration, same size, same level of detail, and so it's taking you the same amount of time to execute, but if it's going to be used on a package for, maybe a regional company, it could be significantly more expensive, like in the range of $1,000. In addition, you could potentially have a fairly complex illustration that's being used for a half page in a magazine or newspaper, or maybe a banner for a website, and that complex illustration would command a lower price than a simple illustration that's going to be used on a t-shirt or in an ad. So again, the handbook is so helpful here because the spectrum of prices really does vary just enormously from industry to industry, and I think it's important to not devalue illustration. So whenever you're pricing things, you're thinking about yourself, obviously, and if you need that job and you need that work, of course, but always do keep in mind as well that what you accept for a price affects everybody else in the industry. So it's something to keep in mind for sure. Now, part of the reason there is such a discrepancy between editorial illustration and packaging illustration, for example, is that with packaging illustration, the illustration is used in a very prominent way. It's on that package. It's being used to sell that product. Everyone that sees that product is going to see the illustration. Whereas in a magazine, there's probably quite a lot of other illustration or other imagery. It's in and amongst other elements, and another big factor is that a magazine, their use for it is going to be relatively limited. So if they're getting a license to use it in the magazine, essentially, that they can put it in that magazine one time, maybe they get some web rights as well, but they can't go then and like make t-shirts out of it, or put it in their brochures, or they really can only use it for that one purpose, for that one short period of time. Whereas in packaging illustration, a lot of the time a much more comprehensive license is required. So they're going to want to use, they have an illustration to use license, your permission to use the illustration for, in some cases, an indefinite period of time. So that's kind of exclusively theirs forever. Whereas with the magazine, it might be 3 months or 6 months or, a year or something like that. So, all of these different factors, how many people see your work, how many times your work is going to be printed, what it's using, what it's being used for, if it's selling something or illustrating something in a magazine. There are so many different factors to consider. Basically, I think we have all of the pieces now. So we have covered timelines, and we've covered pricing, usage and pricing, and those are the three basic ingredients for any proposal or contract, and a contract is going to have some other elements too, but that's what we're going to cover in the next segment. And the next segment is going to be basically putting it all together. So taking the timeline that you've made, your usage scenario that you've determined for the client, and the pricing, what the job is actually going to cost, and putting that all together into a proposal and into a contract as well. So we will go over all of that in the next video. Yes, thank you for watching. Please do hit the thumbs up button if you liked the video, if you found it helpful. Leave a comment, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.